What is going on, everybody? We are doing the Romanishin Variation today, which is a sub-variant of the Potter Variation. So E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, D4, E captures D4, knight captures D4, bishop C5, and knight B3 marks the first move of the Potter Variation. Main line for Potter is bishop tucks away to B6 since it was under attack. But in the Romanishin variation, the bishop comes to b4 to check the king. There's two main moves for like the main play, main line, and that is bishop to d2 and the more common move, c3. There are other ways that technically are possible, but they go against, basic principles. It is technically possible to block with the knight on d2, but you could be developing a move rather than moving that knight for the fourth time, and that blocks in your dark squared bishop. The knight is possible to go to d2 from b1. Same thing, it's blocking in your dark square bishop. And it's possible to block on c3, but there's better options, the two main variants, because black can just capture and double your pawns right on move 7. So that's no bueno. We're going to cover the move c3 first, and the bishop will always go to e7. It's the best move, and there are 5 different okay ways to proceed from here. And the good thing about the Romanishin variation, there are the main line, which people follow, but almost every turn, there's a plethora of moves which are, possible, score good. There's really no difference in evaluation from the main line and, let's say, the runner-up and the runner-up after that move on a lot of these moves. So the 5 main replies in order from most popular to least popular that I'm going to cover. F4, bishop F4, G3, C4, and last but not least, knight D4. Now, the main move, if you play knight D4, the bishop will return to C5, and this is a transposition on the Malaniuk Variation. And the Malaniuk Variation is when black moves on their 4th turn, they go b4 with the bishop with a check, and you would push c3, and then the bishop would go to c5. It's the exact same position, so obviously we're not going to cover that one. The other possibilities are, the knight can capture your knight. You would just recapture with the pawn. They can develop their other knight to f6. But the main line, as we said, is the bishop retreating to c5. The next runner-up move we're going to cover is pawn to c4. The main line continues, knight to f6, so black can castle kingside fast. You bring your knight out to c3, protecting the e4 pawn. Black castles. You bring out your bishop to e2. You don't want to bring out the bishop to d3, because if black marches up the a pawn, and let's say you castle, if they push a4, now your knight can't go to the best square, d4, because the knight on c6 could capture it. It doesn't have protection from the queen. So it's best to put your bishop on e2. And then from here, black will come in and pin your knight to your king. You can't castle, because if the bishop took your knight, you would have to recapture, and you would lose the e4 pawn. So instead of castling, you push f3 first. The dark squared bishop will capture your knight on c3, and you recapture with the pawn. And now black will push d6, opening up space for their light squared bishop. And now it's okay to castle. And that's more or less the main line for the 4th most common move, c4. A couple things I want to mention. what I said earlier about there being a plethora of moves usually on each turn. If you look here, black has a pretty reasonable variety of moves that they can make here. And one of their good moves is bringing the bishop to f6. You have a bunch of responses that you can get away with here. If you bring your bishop looking to castle on e2, black has yet again a bunch of moves that they can get away with. Even if you bring the knight out to c3, black has a bunch of moves they can get away with. So this line is pretty notorious for having a lot of options, but there is the best way to go, and those are the main lines that we're covering. One of the deviations black can do that you have to watch out for and know how to properly handle is if they push a5 nice and early. You do not want to stop it with your a pawn. Instead, continue development for the meantime. Bring your bishop to e2. If they do push a4, kicking your knight, the best square is d4. They're going to continue to develop, looking to castle, and when they bring their knight to f6, you can do your last knight to c3, protecting the e4 pawn. And if they capture your knight in the middle, remain calm, go ahead and recapture with your queen. And from here, they'll either castle and you can castle, or they might push d6 first. You can go ahead and castle, and then they'll castle. After that, your bishop has two good squares. You can either do e3 or f4. Both of them are a-okay in my book. No pun intended. So the number 3 line that we're going to cover now is g3. This line is going to be really easy for me to cover because black makes the exact same moves that we just went over. You know, knight f6, pushing d6, castling kingside, yada, 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 yada. The only thing I will mention that a move black will make in this situation when you push g3 is if they push h5. You do not want to push h4. You just want to push h3. And that is because if they push h4, that's great for you. You can just push g4 and continue on. You're still going to want a fianchetto. You're still going to want a castle kingside. So, for example, knight, bishop, castle, castle. Everyone lives happily ever after. And I will mention, when it comes time to develop the queenside pieces, your bishop can come to e3 before you bring your other knight, the one on b1, to d2. And we're backing up the soul train to do the runner-up now. Runner-up is bishop to f4. This line is also very similar to the previous ones. The only difference is the knight does not come to f6 right away because of the threat of pushing e5. It now has cover by the bishop on f4. So the main move is pushing d6 to prevent e5. And you want to bring your knight out to d2 to cover the e5 pawn and just be ahead of the game. This is the main line. The knight will then come out to f6, and you want to look to castle. So a good square for your bishop is e2. It also prevents their bishop from coming on g4, hitting your queen. They'll castle, and you'll castle. From there, they'll bring their rook over to the e file, and the reason for that is even though it's blocked by the bishop, you develop your queen to c2, protecting the pawn on e4, because now you have two defenders, and as soon as they move that bishop, they have two attackers. They'll bring their bishop to f8, looking to fianchetto it, and that's when you move over your rook to eventually add a third or fourth defender to that pawn. It would be a fourth if you brought your bishop to d3 or f3. They'll push the g-pawn looking to fianchetto, and you can bring your rook over to d1 and take advantage of the semi-open file. They'll fianchetto their bishop, and that's that. And one more time, I just want to mention that there's so many different possibilities. Look at the analysis. After you castle, they have 5 good moves. After they move, you have 5 good moves. After you move, they have 5 good moves. It's really just unlimited possibilities in this line. There's always a plethora of good moves. And with that being said, let's cover the last line on the C3 variation. And that would be simply pushing F4. Just like last line, the knight doesn't want to come to F6 right away. Black is going to push D6 first. You can bring your bishop out to D3, protecting your E4 pawn. And black has two moves. It can either bring the knight to F6 or H6, and they both have different continuations. We'll do F6 first. The main line does continue, bringing your B1 knight to D2. They'll castle, and you'll castle. It also transposes, you can castle, they can castle, and then you bring your knight to D2. They'll bring their rook over to E8, same mojo, trying to get the bishop out the way, add an attacker on the E4 pawn, and then fianchetto the bishop. So you want to bring your queen to C2, adding another defender to the E4 pawn. They'll bring the bishop back to F8, and that's when you want to jump your knight to F3. So it traveled. They'll go ahead and push G6, looking to fianchetto, and you can bring your bishop to D2, and they'll fianchetto. And real quick, got to cover the last little variation. If the knight jumps to H6, you want to castle right away. They'll castle right away. And then you'll bring your knight to D2. Same thing. You can bring your knight to D2 first. They'll castle. You'll castle. It all transposes. And now the battle begins. Their best move is pushing F5. And the way to handle that is do nothing about it yet. Bring your knight over. And they'll capture. You recapture with your bishop. And they'll bring their bishop to F5, attacking yours. Now you got two different things you could do. You can either bring your queen up to check the king, and it'll tuck away in the corner. Then you can capture their bishop, and they'll recapture. Or instead of checking with the queen, you can check with the bishop, and then they'll just tuck away in the corner. So that is basically the continuations. It's a crazy, crazy world. And the initial move of kicking the bishop out with C3, that is the more common way to handle things. But about 30% of the time, the bishop coming to D2 will be played, and it's just as good and just as interesting. I would say the more bland of the two options black has is capturing the bishop. The other one being backing it up by pushing A4. But capturing on D2 we'll cover first because it's pretty short. More or less, you want to recapture with your queen, not with your knights. They'll bring out their knight to F6, attacking your E4 pawn, and that's when you want to go ahead and bring out your knight to C3. And that's exactly why you didn't want to recapture with your knight, because you're looking to castle queenside in this situation, and the overall setup just is not quite as good here because of the open squares for your queen. So you go ahead and develop your knight to C3, and black will castle, and you can castle long. Same standard moves that we've been going through. You see the same pattern going on here. They push D6, and you push F3, linking your pawns together. And they'll bring out the bishop to E6. It's very reminiscent of just the straight Potter variation. And here's where the main line continues, pushing G4. And there's two ways that this can split off. Either the knight on F6 can jump to D7 to come to E5, or if they try being more aggressive, they can push the A pawn to A5, and you want to push A3. You don't want to push A4, because you also want to lock out the B4 square from that knight. And if they push A4, you can bring your knight out to D4, and they'll go ahead and exchange off, and you can recapture with the queen. And then they'll reroute their knight to the E5 square. And now, I think the more interesting of all the lines is when black goes ahead and gets their A pawn involved right off the get-go. You do not want to capture the bishop because they'll recapture and open up the A file. Instead, you want to push A3, making the bishop make a move. And we're going to save the best one for last, where the bishop backs out. But if the bishop exchanges, you want to recapture with the queen. Same reasoning as last line, why we don't capture with either of the knights. Black is safe to develop their knight to f6 because you can't push e5. That would be horrible for you. So you want to bring your other knight to c3. They'll castle and you'll castle. They'll push d6, opening up their light squared bishop to the action, and you want to back up your e4 pawn by pushing f3, just like regular Potter lines. And when they bring the bishop to e6, you want to tuck your king over to b1. They can bring their knight to d7, or they can push the a pawn, kicking out the knight on b3. If that's the case, bring it out to d4, and black will go ahead and exchange off. Last but not least, the knight will come to d7 to reroute. And if you don't want to bring your king over to b1 instantly, you can develop your bishop and put it on e2. That's also a decent move to do. And last but not least, we got to cover if the bishop backs out to e7. First, you have to take care of the threat of them pushing a4, because your knight has no good squares to go to except for going back to c1. I have seen a couple master games where the knight definitely did go to c1 and then jump back out to either d3 or less often e2. So you can bring the bishop to e3, adding 2 defenders to the d4 square, your queen and the bishop. They got 2 moves. They can either bring their bishop to f6 or their knight. If they bring their bishop, you just want to go ahead and develop your other knight, and they're going to go ahead and capture that knight and double up your pawns. And then they'll bring out their knight, finishing development, and you can bring your bishop to d3, making sure your e4 pawn doesn't fall. They can push d5, you can capture it, and they'll recapture it, and then you want to move your bishop out of harm's way. They'll castle and you'll castle. Or if they don't push d5, they can go ahead and castle right away. You can castle right away, and then they'll push d5. Same thing, exchange, tuck away. Sometimes they just push the pawn to d6 instead, and that's when you can go ahead and pin the knight to the queen. If they bring their knight out to f6, you still want to bring your knight out to c3. At least now your pawns won't be doubled. And after they castle, you bring your bishop to e2. And their best move is the threat of a4. You want to bring your knight to d4, and they're going to go ahead and exchange off, and you recapture it with the bishop, not with the queen. They'll push d6, and that's when you're finally okay to castle. That covers the Romanishin Variation. You know, we had a little Rosenthal in there, a little bit of classic, a little bit of Potter, a little bit of sprinkle some crack on top. Wrapping things up, I want to say that I am honored to be making these videos for you guys, and I appreciate every last one of you. I will see you on the next video.